All right, let's get started on part 2 of this discussion for chapter 2. In our last discussion, we talked a little bit about importing and linking CAD files. Remember that Revit and AutoCAD are both made by Autodesk, and so the interchangeability between DWG files and Revit files is really good. They do a really nice job, and you can pull a CAD file into any Revit model. It doesn't quite work as well the other way, going Revit into AutoCAD, but I think there is an export feature in Revit that makes that possible. But that's not usually part of the workflow. Normally, when we're going to be merging CAD files and Revit files, it's going to be the CAD file linked in or inserted into the Revit file. And the main purpose for that is to sort of bring in legacy drawings and trace those and sort of convert them into three-dimensional models. Another really good reason that we'd want to bring a CAD file into a Revit model is a lot of times laying out the floor plan. A lot of drafters, especially legacy drafters that have been doing this a while, really feel like making the floor plan is easier in AutoCAD. And that's true for detail drawings as well. In a lot of cases, drafting in 2 dimensions is just second nature for a lot of people. So we see a lot of interchanging between those two. It's an important skill that you should learn. The other thing we set up were the levels, and we created those levels, and you can see in this 3D view that those levels are depicted in the 3D views as well, as long as their visibility settings are set accordingly. Another thing you'll want to pay attention to is that each one of these levels is selectable in a 3D view, and you can even drag the length and the width of these levels right in a 3D view using these grips. That will, however, affect what they look like in 2-dimensional views like elevations and sections. Today we're going to be talking about grids, and before we jump into how to create grids, it's important to understand what a grid is, and we really haven't had a chance yet in any of our other architectural classes to talk about grid lines. So because oftentimes a picture is worth 1,000 words, I think the best place to start that discussion is by taking a look at an existing plan. Now you may remember this plan. This is our Diesel Tech building, also known as Badlands Hall, and this one does use grid lines on the floor plan. So if you look along the perimeter, these little bubbles that are occurring on the outside above the dimension lines, and it's also on all 4 sides of the building. You can see the grid lines are showing up all the way around this thing, but those grids are defining the location of things, and we're usually going to use those only on commercial structures. Large buildings with oftentimes are going to have steel columns in them or other things that are structural like concrete, brick, and other things like that. But let's go ahead and take a look at what these grid lines represent. We have grid 1, 3, and 4. You see they skipped 2. Let's come down here and see if we can figure out what's going on. So what are these grid lines lined up with? Well, it's a little hard to tell because of the line weight, but you can see that the grid lines are coming in and they're tying in with the outside face of the brick is what it looks like. Now, more than likely, that's also tying in with the outside face of the foundation wall, which is going to be running underneath the brick. We wouldn't know for sure unless we looked at some of these section views to really tell exactly what that's lined up with. But it's a really common thing in a situation like this where we don't actually have any steel columns to use grid lines to define the edge of the concrete. If we zoom back out and we come over here and we take a look in this area, this, you may recall, this section over this larger building section is actually precast concrete. You can see all the individual precast panels sort of defined by these dividing lines. And you can see that, again, the grid lines are lined up with the outer edge of that. And most likely, those are also going to be aligned with the outside face of the foundation. Let's take a look at one other building, and that is our what we call the Sim Center, and this is the Medical Simulation Building officially. So let's go ahead and zoom in on this, and you can see, yep, we're using grid lines for this as well. You can see that there are numbers across the top. That's fairly standard, starting on the left with 1 and increasing accordingly. And then we typically are going to start with A down at the bottom and work up. So we typically have letters on the left and right, numbers on the top and bottom. But in this case, they use the grid lines in a slightly different way. You can see that number 1, if we follow that down here, That's just defining the center of this large canopy column right here. The building ones, however, are the grid lines are going to line directly up with, again, the edge of the masonry, which we can assume also is going to be the edge of the foundation. But then there's also another sort of line. It's not really a grid line, it's just sort of a reference line 9 inches away from the grid line, and that is where we're going to be placing the center of the steel columns. So this building does have steel columns in it and masonry, and so they just had to use kind of this little bit slightly different technique, slightly unique technique of defining the outside face of the concrete with the grid lines and then a reference line just showing where those columns go. So the reason we use grid lines instead of just dimensions is because oftentimes we're going to reference something. On a large complex building, it's really nice to be able to reference exactly where something is, like a column. So we can say that column E5, for example, we're going to be able to identify exactly where that is very quick and easy. Okay, so that's the what and the how, or the what and the where, I guess, and let's talk about the how next. So let's use the building that we created in part 1 and let's see if we can add some of those grid lines. And you can see there are some similarities between this and the buildings we were just looking at. In this case, we have a CMU cavity wall. We have this inner withe of CMU and an outer withe of brick. And so where would be a good place based on what we just looked at to set up those column lines? One of the things we need to know first is, are we going to have interior columns or not? And in this case, the answer is going to be yes, but only relative to the interior space. So we're going to assume that the exterior space, we're going to line that column, or excuse me, that grid line up with the outside face like we did before, but we're going to have some interior columns that we're going to place. So we're going to need those lines, those grid lines, to define where those columns are going to be. So we're going to use 20 feet as our grid line spacing. So let's go ahead and place our first one. For this, we're going to go to the Architecture tab. All the way over to the right on the Datum panel, we have the Grid tool. Let's go ahead and click on that. And drawing grid lines can be done in a number of different ways. As you can see, you can actually create an arc if you need to, a couple different ways. You can just use the Line tool to draw it, which is probably the easiest and the most intuitive. Pick 2 points. And then the third way is to pick an existing thing. Pick Lines tool is another option. So I'm going to go ahead and just demonstrate the Line tool first. And we need to make sure that we're lined up. For this, anytime you have line weights that kind of maybe obscure a little bit of the detail, it's sometimes a good idea, in fact usually, to turn on thin lines. And that doesn't change how this prints, it just changes what you're able to see. So now I can see exactly where all the individual layers are. And I know that I want to line this first one up with this. So I'm going to pick a point right here as my first point. And I'm going to draw the, I'll just draw it up like this for my first line. And then I do need to take and show the grip and then grab that grip and drag it down so that I can extend it out beyond the building like so. Remember that the grid lines need to be sort of the last thing, that's the furthest thing out. So we need to leave plenty of room for our dimensions in here, right? Which we're not going to do today, but just good practice. All right, so with this first grid line, I'm going to go ahead and select it and put a checkbox next to, or right in this one, Show Bubble. So we want to see it on both sides. And then I also, remember we have numbers across the top. So why it's starting with E is not really clear to me, but we're going to go ahead and select that and I'm going to change it to a 1. Now if you didn't catch what I did, I just selected it once and then I clicked it again and it went into text edit mode. So now I've changed it to 1. Presumably the next one I create, 20 feet over, should automatically number to 2 now. So it's a good idea to do that first before you create your additional ones. So the next one that I'm going to create, I can do one of 2 ways. I can draw it in, or I can just copy the existing one. And I think you know which one of those 2 things is going to be easiest because I need to move this a specific distance. So let's go ahead and just copy this over. I click on it, go to the copy tool. Now I can just pick a point up here in space for my first point, my base point. And then you can see the listening dimension there It's going to show me right when it gets to 20 feet. I could also just type in 20 at that point. But I'm just going to go ahead and click here. And it did create my second grid line, and I can just repeat that process all the way across 20 feet each time. Got to be a little bit careful with not moving your cursor when you click. But if you're zoomed out far enough, the increments increase accordingly. So you can see that as I move my cursor, it's changing in 6-inch increments. If I zoom in, that increment oftentimes will get smaller. So you can see now it's 1-inch increments. So keep yourself zoomed out far enough to where it's just easier to pick the increment that you want. And I'll click this last point, and it does look like I made a mistake on this building. I did not make this exactly 100 feet long. So my bad there, but it's going to work anyway. We're going to go ahead and set in our horizontal grid lines next. So let's go ahead and start at the bottom. We'll use that grid tool again. This time I want to use the pick lines tool. I just want to see how easy this is. So pick lines, make sure that you pick the outermost edge of the brick layer. And it did create that grid line, but I do need to, again, grab those grips and just drag it out a little bit away from the building so that I have room for my dimensions. I'll put the checkbox in there, and you can see it started with number 7. Obviously, I'm going to have to change that. Drag this out about the same distance. And let's go ahead and change that 7 to an A, capital A. Oops. All right, so it will change both of them for you. Now we can just copy that up. Sometimes you gotta hit escape or click the modify tool to cancel the command. We'll go ahead and copy that up 20 feet. This time I'm just gonna move it and type 20, enter. And it did place it right at 20 feet. I can do that again. 40. Oops, that was too far. We'll come back from that one, 20. All right, I got my letters out of sequence. I'm just going to try that again. 20 and 20. All right, and it looks like I built that the wrong way here too, but you get the idea, hopefully. All right, so we have grid lines defining the outer edge of the building. Not really, but we could. All right, let's go ahead and just fix it. I can't do this the wrong way. If I go to the Modify tab, remember that you have the Align tool, which is really handy. If I click that first and that second, it brings it in. And I'm going to do the same thing up here. Pick that first and pick that second, brings it down. Okay, now my building's the right size. Okay, so I have A, B, C, and D along the left and right side, 1 through 6 along the top and bottom. The next thing we need to do is add the columns. And as mentioned, we're not going to follow suit on the Sim Center and place columns at the perimeter. We're just going to place them where the grids intersect in the middle. So we're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4 across and just 2 vertically, right? So a total of 8 columns in here. For that, we're going to go to the Architecture tab or the Structure tab. There's 2 different ways we can do this. There's a structural column and there's an architectural column. So actually, we are going to go to the structural column. The architectural column, the difference there is that architectural columns are basically the outer decoration around a structural column. So a lot of times we cover those things up with either drywall or something else to both protect it from fire and to make it look prettier and more durable if you have insulation on it, for example. So we need to place the structural column first. And for this, we're going to go ahead and pick a column type. And in this case, we really don't have a lot to choose from. We have a W10 by 33 and a 10 by 49. I'm going to go ahead and do the 10 by 33, a slightly smaller one. And if you zoom in on it, you can see that it is in the shape of a wide flange beam, which is exactly what a column usually is. Generally, they're going to be a little more squarish in shape when we're using them for columns. But you can see that the cursor is attached to the column at its exact center. So if we place it right at the intersection, as you see right here, it's going to place it in the exact location it needs to be. We're always going to, with structural columns, we're always going to place those based on their center in both directions. So that's exactly how Revit is set up to place them. Now you could place them offset from those grids, and in some very rare cases we're going to do that, but in most cases it's going to be right on the center of that grid line. All right, before we place it, let's look at just a couple other things. Let's make sure that our settings are correct in our options bar. You can see that I have mine. You can set it to depth if you're going to, for example, use a column as a pile, drive it into the ground, but we're going to set it to height. We are on level 1 and we're going to run that up to level 7. Level 8 is actually on mine for whatever reason is below level 1, so we're gonna run that thing up to level 7. So we're going from level 1 to level 7. That's going to run at the full height, and I'm ready to go now. Now I can place that column right here. So that worked. I'm going to go ahead and click Modify to cancel that command. Remember that with structural columns, you also get the option of placing it at grids. The problem, though, is that if we did that, it's going to place it at, for example, D1, and we don't have a column at D1. So sometimes it's easier just to, even from a zoomed out position like this, place those columns individually. There's only 8 of them, so we're really not saving all that much time by using that Place at Grids tool. All right, so it did go ahead and place all those columns in there. Let's take a look in a 3D view, make sure it looks correct, and it does. Those things go all the way up to the level that we specified, and they go down all the way to the level that we specified as well. Now, one other trick, this is a good time to demonstrate. When you get a lot of the same thing in there, let's say we needed to make a change. That column type, we made a mistake, and we needed the bigger one, not the smaller one. Well, we all know, or hopefully we're learning, that if you select an object, it shows you the properties of that object, including its type, the type that you specified when you placed it. And all you have to do to change that type is to pick another one in the list. And if you don't have the one that you need, you can always load a new family type, right? But in this case, we could just pick this 10 by 49, and now that column is going to be a different one than all the rest. But if you had to do that to all of them, it wouldn't make sense to repeat that process 8 times. It makes much more sense to right-click on the column and say Select All Instances, and you can either select all instances visible in the current view, which is all of them, or you could say in entire project if you happen to be on a floor plan and you couldn't see all of the things like doors, for example. But you can select them all using either one of these, and it will pick all of them of that type. You'll notice it didn't pick the first one I selected because I already changed it. But that's a quick way that we can change the properties of multiple things all at once, and it saves a ton of time doing it that way. Again, that's not exclusive to grids or columns. That is with any object. I could do that with walls or doors or windows. But just remember, it's only going to select all of those instances that are that specific type. Another handy trick on selecting multiple items all at once is to position your view in such a way that you can drag a box around it and just select everything. And then we can filter out those things. Whenever you have a selection set, you have this filter tool, and you can filter out the types of things that you don't want. So if, for example, we only wanted to select the columns, it doesn't matter what type of column they are. If they fall into the column category, we can just uncheck the things we don't want selected. And now we've got all of those columns selected. So try to keep in mind those 2 tools because we're going to use those over and over again. And it is a really big time saver for you. Okay, let's go back to level 1 for a minute. Let's take a look at these grid lines again. You can see that when we select the grid line, we get this familiar little 3D symbol there, and we get another one on the other side. So remember that the grid lines, even though in a 3D view, we see them only on down there near the ground, you can see that by hovering over those grid lines are actually going to be visible all the way through our model. So for example, if we go to level 4, we should see those grid lines. Very similar in how they function to levels. They're just running vertically instead of horizontally. But if we select that, remember that if we change this, if we drag it to the right, that's going to happen in all of our views. But there might be an instance where we only want to pull this one column line, this grid line over, but not have it change in all of our other views. In that case, just like with levels, we would change this from 3D to 2D. And now anything that I do with it, like put a little jog in it, that's only going to happen in this view. So we can see that if we go to any other level, that grid right there still looks like the original. Okay, so that'll conclude our discussion about grid lines and columns. There are a few additional miscellaneous things I want to include in this discussion just because it was fairly short, and these are some things that are related and frequently used. So the earlier we can kind of tackle them, the better off we are. One of the things is visibility settings for imported categories. So you'll remember in part 1, we linked and we imported or inserted a CAD file into the drawing or into the project here. So I don't actually have mine linked still, so I'm just going to go ahead and link that in. I'm going to go back to the Link CAD tool. I'm going to bring in that classroom drawing. Remember the settings down here. There are ways that we can import this only into the current view, or we could have it visible in every view. That's this little check mark right here. I'm just going to leave it unchecked so that it's visible everywhere. All these other things, very often we're going to be using the defaults on those, but sometimes it's important to understand where you need it to go if you're bringing it into an existing project. So I'm just going to go ahead and bring it in at a random location, and we're just going to kind of let the defaults rule the day for now. So there's my CAD file. You can see that it brought it in its original colors that it was drawn in. The layers that it was on, we're using magenta and cyan, as you can tell. And there are occasions where we want those CAD files to be part of our view. Now this is not a good example of that because it's just sort of a random shape in the middle of a different building, right? But in other cases, we might have a CAD file where we actually want to leave that in the view, but it's the wrong color. It came in its original colors, and we might want to modify that in some way. So we can change what a CAD file looks like without actually changing the CAD file itself. We can just override the graphics of that CAD file to make it black and white or green or whatever color we want exactly. Same thing with line types. We can change the line thickness, the line types, all of that stuff. So there's a couple different ways that we can access overriding what something looks like. One of them is just by right-clicking on the thing and going to Override Graphics in View. We're going to say by element in this case. And we don't get a lot of options here. We get a transparency setting, and we also have this flyout here that we can expand open a little bit. Up here at the top we have whether it's visible or not, which right now obviously it is. And we can also turn this into a halftone object where it was just sort of faded a little bit. But let's pop this open and let's try to adjust the color, see if we can make all of it the same color. I'm just going to go ahead and change this to black, say OK again, and now you can see that it's converted to a black and white drawing. So any of those things under the Override Graphics in View that you can change, the pattern, so the line types, right? If we wanted to change the line type of this thing, the line color, and even the line weight. If we want it to be a little bit thicker, let's bump that up to 3 and see what that looks like. So now it's all hidden lines, black and white still, turn off thin lines. We can actually see the line weight of that thing. So lots of stuff that we can do quickly and easily without actually having to edit that CAD file. So interestingly, that way and the other way I'm going to show you are only going to affect how that looks in this one view. So it's not a global change. Whenever we're talking about an override, remember that we're talking about something that we're not actually changing the thing, we're just changing what it looks like in this one view. Okay. So the other way that we can override that is by going to the visibility graphic overrides, there's that word again, clicking on this, and now we would have to find what category that thing belongs to. Well, this would be under imported categories. You can see that there's the classroom DWG there, listed there. And if we click on override, that's going to bring up a similar thing, right? So we'll go ahead and cancel out of that. We're going to leave that override in place. But just to demonstrate that that is not going to look that way everywhere, we go to level 2, for example, and we can still see that thing in its original color and line types. Same thing would be true in a 3D view, or really any other view that you can actually see that imported CAD file. It's going to look just like it did when we brought it in everywhere that we didn't overwrite it. Okay, I also want to take this opportunity to discuss something called reference planes. You've heard me mention that before. Those are going to be accessed from the Architecture tab, and they're very close to the datum panel, the grid tool, and they function in a lot of ways similarly to grids. Reference planes are right here, and reference planes are created, again, just by either picking 2 points using the line tool. Let's go ahead and create one over here, or by using the pick lines tool to pick an existing object to define the location of that reference plane. Reference planes are also selectable, and they can be modified using the 3D or 2D option. So in terms of their behavior, they function very much like grid lines do, and they function very much like levels do as well. But grid lines are or reference planes rather, are sort of a more of a informal way to define boundaries or define the structure of your layout. And the reason I say informal is because they, by default, are not intended to print. So you could kind of think of them in terms of manual drafting when we lay down guidelines with that blue ink, or blue lead, or just very light lead. When we're drawing out sort of the outline or the main sort of skeleton, if you want to think of it that way, of where our building is going to go, we can use grid lines, and those are intended to print, and they're intended to be labeled and all that stuff. Or you can use reference planes, and those are less formal. In reference planes, I like to use these on residential buildings, right? On residential structures, because we don't use grid lines on residential structures, but we still want some sort of framework to build our house around. So the main purpose of these things, the thing that I find them most useful for, is to lay these down first and then build your walls over the top of them. So we might create reference planes. If we're going to do a rectangle shaped house, we might draw 4 reference planes sort of in a tic-tac-toe pattern. And again, the length of them doesn't really matter. You just want them to overlap a little bit. And then we could create walls based on the location of those things. So if we set our core face exterior and then we drew a rectangular shaped building between these points, now these reference planes are lined up exactly with a portion of this wall, and I didn't really align that the way that I wanted to. But the other handy feature of a reference plane is that they can be pinned. So if I right click on this one and say select all instances visible in view, gets all 4 of them selected, I can then use this pin tool right here to pin them in place. And then I can use the align tool on the modify tab to make sure that the wall is aligned properly. I'm going to turn on thin lines. Is aligned properly. That didn't work. Let me try one more time. Align to this, and then lock that in place. So I could do that in all 4 cases. Align, lock, and align, lock, the 4th one. So the great thing about that is you can set your reference planes out and have them a very specific distance apart. And then when you place your walls on top of those, you know those walls are going to be modular with their spacing, and the corners are going to be perfectly aligned, and they can't be moved. Go ahead and just click and try to drag this over here. It won't let you without you removing those constraints. So when you get these error messages, once you've aligned and locked your walls, make sure you pay attention to them. They're telling you that you're trying to do something, intentionally or not, you're trying to do something against what you had set up previously. We will talk more about reference planes and how they are to be used relative to existing walls and stuff a lot more in the future. Okay, one last topic, and we're going to call it good for this one, and that is discussing how to create system families. Now, Just as a reminder, system families are not things like doors or windows or plumbing fixtures. System families are the main structure of the building, things like walls, roofs, floors, and ceilings. Okay, so when we have a system family, and we're not going to go deep into this today, but I do want to at least talk about how these things are created. We're going to look at the structure of this wall. The way that, what we've been looking at is we have a wall, and then we have an outer and an inner piece, and there's all these various layers within there. How is that created? So I just want to give a quick introduction of where that's at. So if we select one of the walls, the properties of that wall gets displayed in the properties palette, and then we click on edit type. Now at this point, if we were actually going to edit this wall, we would want to duplicate it and give it a new name, right? Because we would change it from brick on metal stud, which it is now, to presumably something else. Okay, but we're not going to change it, so I'm not going to duplicate it and create a new wall type. I'm just going to dig into the existing one for the purpose of viewing it. So click on edit right there in the structure area, and here are all of those various layers that go into that wall. So there are some layers in here that you really can't even see in the floor plan, but they're there because there's a lot of analytical tools within Revit that can detect and verify how, for example, how airtight a wall is, how good it's able to resist heat flow and things like that. So we add all the layers whether they're visible or not. So in this case, we're starting in the inside. Down at the bottom, you can see interior side listed right here. With gypsum wallboard, right under that we know is a vapor barrier. And then you get the core boundary. The core boundary aren't really layers, they're just defining where that structural boundary is. And in this case, you have a metal stud layer. Outside of that, you have sheathing, and then you have an air infiltration barrier or house wrap, and then you have a thermal air layer. This is actually a cavity wall, so there's actually a 3-inch air gap between the air infiltration barrier and the outer withe of brick. Okay, well, we'll get into in another discussion how to create layers and change their materials and change their thicknesses, but for now I just wanted to make sure everybody got in and understood where that stuff was created. We'll talk more about it later. All right, that's going to conclude our discussion for this chapter. I hope it made sense. Please make sure that you reach out if you have any questions. Feel free to rewatch this video as many times as you need to. And then when you get done, make sure that you take your screenshot and submit the assignment on the LMS.